This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Margaret Maggie Akello had spent her life carefully curating an image of perfection. At 52, she was the embodiment of elegance, sophistication, and power. Known as one of the most successful businesswomen in Nairobi, Maggie owned several thriving companies in the hospitality and real estate sectors. Her influence extended beyond the boardrooms of her enterprises and into the exclusive social circles of the city's elite. To the outside world, she was a respected figure, someone who had risen through the ranks with determination and grace, transforming her humble beginnings into a story of triumph. However, behind her poised demeanor lay secrets darker and more complex than anyone could imagine. Maggie lived in a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Nairobi, where high walls and gates shielded her private life from prying eyes. The mansion, with its whitewashed exterior, modern architecture, and sprawling gardens, was a reflection of her success. Inside, the space was an oasis of luxury, each room carefully designed with taste and precision, filled with imported furniture and priceless artwork. The estate was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the demands of her public life. But it was also where she nurtured her most dangerous desires. For years, Maggie had been living a double life. On the surface, she was the disciplined businesswoman, but in her private moments, she indulged in the thrill of her secret relationships with 7 men. These men, each unaware of the others, represented different aspects of her personality and desires, and through them, Maggie maintained a sense of control and dominance. They gave her the affection and attention she craved, but more importantly, they were pawns in a game only she knew the rules to. The first of these men was Joshua, a 33-year-old artist with rugged good looks and an infectious charm. Joshua was the kind of man whose hands were always smeared with paint, his jeans perpetually torn and worn from working in his studio. He lived in a modest apartment downtown, surrounded by unfinished canvases and sketches that reflected his restless creative spirit. To Maggie, Joshua was a refreshing escape from the rigidity of her world. His passion for art, his idealism, and his youthful energy made her feel alive in ways that business dealings never could. In his presence, she could forget about boardroom meetings and financial statements. Joshua was pure spontaneity, a muse for the wild part of her soul that craved freedom. But despite his devotion to her, Joshua was naive, believing he was the only man in Maggie's life, unaware of the web of deceit she had spun around him. Then there was David, a man in his late 40s with power and prestige that rivaled Maggie's own. David worked as a senior government official, someone whose decisions shaped the political landscape of Kenya. He was used to wielding authority, but in Maggie's presence he relinquished that control. She had known David for years. They had a history that went beyond politics and business, marked by brief but intense periods of romance. He represented stability, a man who could offer her protection and influence. But Maggie knew that David's career, built on fragile alliances and secrets of his own, would be at risk if their relationship became public. She played on his fears, keeping him close with the promise of loyalty, while knowing full well that he was just one piece in her carefully constructed puzzle. Malik, a 30-year-old fitness trainer, was another key figure in Maggie's life. Obsessive about his physique, Malik was constantly working to maintain his image as the epitome of physical perfection. His chiseled body and sculpted features drew attention wherever he went, and Maggie reveled in being seen with him at exclusive gyms and high-end clubs. He was vain, constantly admiring himself in mirrors, but Maggie didn't mind. His vanity amused her, and she used it to her advantage. She made sure he knew that he was her prized possession, stroking his ego in just the right way to keep him under her spell. Malik, like the others, believed he held a special place in her heart. Though to Maggie, he was little more than an ornament, someone to show off, to enjoy for his physicality but never truly connect with on a deeper level. In stark contrast to Malik was Anthony, a 40-year-old lawyer who had climbed the ranks of one of Nairobi's most prestigious law firms. Anthony was a man who valued order and discipline, someone who lived his life according to strict rules. He was ambitious, always looking for the next step in his career, and his relationship with Maggie was just one more carefully calculated move. To him, Maggie represented an opportunity to elevate his social standing, to align himself with someone whose wealth and influence could open doors for him. But Maggie was not blind to Anthony's motivations. She played along, feeding his ambition with promises of future partnerships and connections while keeping him at a distance. Anthony's arrogance amused her. He thought he was using her. But in reality, she was always 2 steps ahead, manipulating him to suit her needs. Then there was Leonard, an engineer in his late 30s who was the quietest and most reserved of the men in Maggie's life. Leonard lived a solitary existence, preferring the company of machines and blueprints to people. He had a brilliant mind, capable of solving complex technical problems, but when it came to emotions, he was awkward and unsure of himself. Maggie was drawn to his vulnerability, sensing that Leonard had never experienced a deep emotional connection before her. He was grateful for her attention, and she used that gratitude to control him. Unlike the other men, Leonard never questioned her, never pushed for more than she was willing to give. He was content to live in her shadow, believing that his love for her was enough. But Maggie knew that his devotion was fragile, easily shattered if he ever discovered the truth. Samson, the youngest of the group at 28, was an up-and-coming journalist with a sharp intellect and a relentless drive to make a name for himself. He was ambitious, hungry for stories that would put him on the front pages of national newspapers. Maggie admired his tenacity, and she fed him information that kept him intrigued, ensuring that he would always come back to her for more. To Samson, Maggie was a mystery he wanted to unravel. He believed that their relationship was one of equals, that he could hold his own against her power and influence. But Maggie knew better. She had seen men like Samson before, eager and full of promise but ultimately naive. She used him to gather information, to keep tabs on the political and social landscapes that affected her businesses, all while maintaining the illusion that he was important to her. Finally, there was Jared, a 42-year-old ex-convict whose unpredictable nature made him both dangerous and exciting. Jared had served time for armed robbery, and though he claimed to have reformed, there was always a glint of violence in his eyes. He was the wild card in Maggie's life, someone who could not be easily controlled. But that unpredictability was what drew her to him. She liked the danger he represented, the thrill of being with someone who lived outside the rules of society. Jared was fiercely protective of Maggie, seeing her as his redemption, but his volatile temper made him a constant risk. Maggie knew that Jared's loyalty could turn into fury if he ever felt betrayed, and yet she kept him close, intrigued by the challenge of taming him. These 7 men, Joshua, David, Malik, Anthony, Leonard, Samson, and Jared, formed the foundation of Maggie's secret world. Each fulfilled a different need, and each believed they were the only one who mattered. But Maggie knew better. She was the puppet master, pulling the strings, carefully balancing her lies and manipulations to keep her web intact. It was a dangerous game, one that gave her immense power, but also one that came with the constant risk of discovery. As the story opens, Maggie is at the height of her power, confident in her ability to manage her complex web of relationships. But beneath the surface, cracks are beginning to form. The men are growing restless, suspicious of her secrets, and Maggie, for the first time, starts to feel the weight of the game she has been playing for so long. The stage is set for a collision of passions, jealousy, and betrayal that will ultimately lead to her tragic demise. As Margaret Maggie Akello continued to manage her tangled web of relationships, a sense of control remained firmly in her hands. She had perfected the art of compartmentalization, assigning each man a place in her life like pieces on a chessboard. She calculated every move with precision, careful to maintain the illusion of exclusivity with each lover. For years, this delicate balance worked flawlessly. However, the cracks in her world began to form quietly, in the small details that even she, with all her cunning, failed to anticipate. It began with Joshua, the artist. For months, Joshua had been engrossed in an ambitious new series of paintings. Maggie's presence was his greatest inspiration, and he poured his emotions onto the canvas, believing their connection to be profound and unique. But as Maggie became more elusive, skipping their regular meetings with vague excuses, Joshua's creativity stalled. Frustration crept into his work, and his once loose grip on reality tightened with anxiety. His calls went unanswered for days at a time, and when they did meet, Maggie was distant, her mind elsewhere. This shift in her behavior planted the first seed of doubt in Joshua's mind. Restless, he began to suspect that something was amiss. Late one evening, while meeting a friend for drinks, he casually mentioned his growing discomfort. To his shock, his friend mentioned seeing Maggie with another man at a gallery opening. It was a passing comment, but one that stirred something dark and unshakable within Joshua. He had always known Maggie attracted attention, but he convinced himself that her devotion to him was real. Now uncertainty gnawed at his heart, and with it came a dangerous mix of insecurity and possessiveness. Joshua's vibrant creativity turned into sleepless nights and obsessive thoughts. He could not let go of the image of Maggie with someone else. Though he lacked proof, The suspicion alone was enough to erode the trust he had once held in her. Meanwhile, David, the government official, had begun his own quiet investigation. His suspicions were not born from a casual remark, but from his own political instincts, honed over decades in the corridors of power. David was no fool. He knew that Maggie's affections were not as simple as they appeared, and though he harbored a deep emotional attachment to her, his professional intuition sensed something larger at play. There were too many unexplained absences, too many late nights where Maggie claimed to be attending business meetings. David had seen enough scandals in his career to recognize the patterns of deceit, and as a man who valued his reputation above all else, he could not afford to be caught in any scandal, especially one involving a woman like Maggie. Using his political connections, David discreetly gathered information on Maggie's activities. What he discovered unsettled him. Though the details were vague, there were enough whispers, rumors of Maggie's involvement with younger men, unexplained visits to exclusive clubs, and hidden transactions that suggested she was funding someone's lifestyle. The picture wasn't clear, but it was enough to stoke David's fears. He felt his grip on Maggie slipping, and worse still, his carefully curated public image was now at risk. Paranoia set in. He became increasingly distant, afraid that any public association with Maggie would lead to questions he wasn't prepared to answer. But walking away from her wasn't easy. Maggie still had power over him, the kind of allure that made him irrational despite his better judgment. Yet David knew that if her secrets became public, the consequences could destroy both of them. Malik, the fitness trainer, was less subtle in his jealousy. His entire identity was built on the admiration of others, and to him, Maggie's sudden coldness felt like a direct assault on his self-worth. Accustomed to the attention his physique and good looks brought him, Malik couldn't tolerate the thought of being replaced. He prided himself on being the pinnacle of health and masculinity, believing Maggie cherished him for these very reasons. But recently, Maggie had been less available, giving him excuses about her business commitments and traveling more frequently than usual. The more time passed, the more Malik's insecurities bubbled to the surface. Unable to cope with the rejection, Malik began stalking Maggie's social media accounts and even resorted to showing up unannounced at her estate, though he never saw anything suspicious. His jealousy spiraled out of control, and soon Malik wasn't just checking her online profiles, he started following her. He would wait outside her favorite restaurants, fitness clubs, and high-end boutiques, hoping to catch her in the act of betraying him. His mind raced with possibilities. Who was she seeing? Who could possibly be better than him? Malik was certain that someone else had taken his place in Maggie's life, but every time he confronted her, she deflected with her usual charm, soothing his concerns with empty reassurances. Yet Malik's patience was wearing thin, and with it, the veneer of control he had over his emotions. While Malik seethed, Anthony, the successful lawyer, approached the situation with cold calculation. Anthony had always seen his relationship with Maggie as transactional. He was under no illusion of romance. He wanted the power and prestige that came with being associated with someone as influential as Maggie. But recently, Anthony began to suspect that Maggie was using him just as much as he was using her. His suspicions were confirmed when a well-connected acquaintance mentioned seeing Maggie in the company of a younger, athletic man at a high-end cocktail party. Anthony's ego couldn't handle the thought of being outmaneuvered by someone who, in his view, was beneath him. He saw himself as a master strategist, always a step ahead, but Maggie's games were starting to fray his nerves. Deciding to take matters into his own hands, Anthony hired a private investigator to follow Maggie and document her activities. The evidence that returned was both incriminating and infuriating. The photos showed Maggie with multiple men, some familiar, others complete strangers to Anthony. His suspicions had been confirmed. He wasn't the only man in her life. Fueled by rage, Anthony began plotting his next move. But unlike Malik or Joshua, Anthony wasn't motivated by emotion. His vengeance would be calculated, precise, and designed to hurt Maggie where it mattered most, her reputation. As Anthony began his covert campaign of gathering evidence, Leonard, the quiet engineer, remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. Of all the men in Maggie's life, Leonard was the least threatening, the most easily manipulated. Maggie had always viewed Leonard as a safe bet, someone who would never challenge her, someone who could be kept in the dark indefinitely. But even Leonard couldn't escape the growing tension. As Maggie spent less time with him, his normally placid demeanor became tinged with sadness. He didn't suspect her of infidelity, but he felt the shift in their relationship, sensing that he no longer held her attention in the way he once did. Leonard's quiet despair contrasted sharply with the fiery emotions of the other men, but it was no less dangerous. His isolation made him vulnerable, and if the truth ever reached him, Maggie knew his fragile trust would shatter. Samson, the journalist, was the first to put the pieces together. His sharp instincts, honed from years of uncovering hidden truths, told him that Maggie was hiding something. His curiosity, initially professional, soon became personal. Samson started to investigate Maggie's background, using his skills as a journalist to dig into her past. What he uncovered wasn't just a series of indiscretions, it was a pattern of deception. He found connections between her business dealings and some of the men in her life. Contracts awarded to companies run by Joshua, payments to Malik's gym, political favors linked to David, all the threads led back to Maggie. Samson realized that he was part of a larger game, one that Maggie had been playing for years. Fueled by both professional ambition and personal betrayal, Samson considered exposing Maggie's double life in an explosive expose. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized the potential fallout for everyone involved, including himself. The power Maggie wielded, the influence she had over so many lives, made her dangerous. If he went public with his findings, he could ruin not only her, but several influential men who could destroy him in retaliation. Torn between his desire for revenge and the fear of the consequences, Samson's internal conflict grew, making him increasingly unstable. The wild card in this tangled web was Jared, the ex-convict. Jared was unpredictable, prone to sudden bursts of anger and utterly devoted to Maggie. But even his devotion had its limits. When he overheard a conversation suggesting that Maggie had been unfaithful, his simmering temper boiled over. Unlike the others, Jared didn't stew in silence. He confronted Maggie directly, accusing her of betrayal. Maggie, ever the manipulator, managed to calm him, for a time, but Jared's trust was irreparably damaged. His violent tendencies, barely contained, now simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. The men, now united by their growing suspicions and insecurities, each began to unravel in their own way. Jealousy, fear, and anger gnawed at them, and Maggie's once precise control started to slip. The balance she had so carefully maintained was collapsing, and with it, the fragile stability of her life. Each man was a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before they collided, with deadly consequences. The precarious balance Maggie Aello had maintained for years finally started to tip. What had once been a perfectly orchestrated game of manipulation and deceit was now spiraling out of her control. The threads of her intricate web, which had held together 7 men in blissful ignorance, were fraying. Secrets, long buried and carefully hidden, began to emerge, and with them came the inevitable conflict, intensifying the dangerous situation Maggie found herself in. The first major breach came when Jared, the volatile ex-convict, stumbled upon undeniable proof of Maggie's betrayal. Jared had always been a man of suspicion, prone to jealousy and quick to act on his emotions. But Maggie had managed to keep him tethered with promises of loyalty, using her charm and power to control his more violent impulses. However, when Jared accidentally found a receipt from an expensive restaurant, one that he had never visited with Maggie, the walls of his trust came crashing down. The date on the receipt was damning, coinciding with one of the nights she had claimed to be away on business. Enraged, Jared's mind raced, filling in the gaps with dark imaginings of what Maggie might have been doing, and with whom. Jared's first instinct was to confront Maggie, but years of living on the edge had taught him patience. He didn't explode immediately. Instead, he followed her, watching her movements with a predator's gaze. His suspicions were confirmed when he saw her in the company of Malik, the muscular fitness trainer. The sight of Maggie smiling at another man, so casually intimate, ignited a fury in Jared that he could barely contain. Malik, unaware that he was being watched, had no idea of the danger lurking just beyond the shadows. Jared's jealousy reached a fever pitch, and in his mind Malik became the embodiment of every man who had ever wronged him. This wasn't just about Maggie, it was about his entire life of betrayal and deception. But rather than acting on his rage immediately, Jared decided to wait. He needed to confront Maggie in a way that would hurt her as much as she had hurt him. While Jared stewed in his anger, Anthony, the lawyer, was moving forward with his own plans. The private investigator he had hired had gathered enough evidence to show that Maggie's affairs were not only numerous but also interconnected. Anthony's arrogance had initially led him to believe he was in control of the situation, but the investigation revealed that Maggie had been using him, just as she had used the others. For a man who prided himself on always being in command, this revelation was intolerable. He wasn't just another lover, he was a man of power, wealth, and influence. How could Maggie dare to play him for a fool? Anthony's ego was bruised, but his mind remained sharp. He knew that a direct confrontation would only give Maggie the upper hand. Instead, he quietly began to gather leverage, ensuring that if he went down, he wouldn't go down alone. He dug deeper into Maggie's business dealings, finding irregularities that could be used against her. Maggie had been careful, but even the most meticulous plans left a trail, and Anthony, with his legal expertise, was adept at following it. The pieces of evidence started to come together: financial records showing unexplained transactions to Joshua, the artist, and David, the government official. Maggie had tied herself to each of the men not just emotionally, but financially and politically as well. Anthony realized that if the full extent of these connections were revealed, it wouldn't just be a personal scandal, it would be a catastrophe that could ruin reputations, careers, and possibly lives. As Anthony's investigation deepened, Samson, the journalist, was on a similar path. His natural curiosity had led him to uncover a trail of breadcrumbs that Maggie had not intended to leave behind. Samson had always prided himself on being able to see through lies, but the deeper he dug into Maggie's life, the more he realized how thoroughly he had been deceived. Maggie had used him to gather information, feeding him just enough to keep him hooked, while all the time leading him to believe he was her equal, her intellectual match. Now that illusion was shattered. Samson began piecing together a story that could destroy Maggie, but it wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about the truth. He felt a professional obligation to expose her, to bring her manipulations to light. But the more he uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. He discovered connections between Maggie and powerful figures, including David, the government official. If he published his findings, it wouldn't just be Maggie who fell. David's political career would be in jeopardy, and there were other men with influence and resources who could retaliate against him if the story came to light. Despite these risks, Samson continued to compile his evidence, unsure of what his next move should be. The weight of the truth, combined with his personal sense of betrayal, pushed him to the brink. He started losing sleep, his once clear vision of justice muddied by fear and anger. Each day that passed without action made him more unstable, and the pressure of holding on to so many secrets began to unravel his composure. While Samson wrestled with his conscience, David, the politician, received a troubling tip-off. A colleague in the intelligence community mentioned that his name had surfaced in an investigation connected to Maggie. At first, David dismissed it as gossip, but when he looked further, he realized that Samson's investigation had come dangerously close to exposing their relationship. David's career, built on years of political maneuvering, was now in jeopardy. If the story broke, it would be a scandal that could end his aspirations in a single stroke. He knew Samson knew his ambition and his relentless pursuit of the truth, and realized that the journalist was far too close for comfort. David's reaction was coldly calculated. He used his influence to have Samson investigated, turning the tables on the journalist. If Samson tried to expose him, David would ensure that his career would be destroyed first. He wasn't going to let Maggie's recklessness bring him down. But even as he made these moves, David couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was slipping out of control. Maggie, once a source of excitement and passion, was now a liability, a ticking time bomb that could explode at any moment. And if it did, the fallout would reach far beyond just him. At the same time, Joshua, the artist, had reached his breaking point. His obsession with Maggie had consumed him. The doubts that had once been whispers in his mind were now deafening roars, and when he stumbled upon a photograph of Maggie and Anthony, the lawyer, at an event together, it was the final blow. Joshua's fragile sense of reality collapsed. He could no longer paint. His creativity had been devoured by the black hole of jealousy and betrayal. Maggie had been his muse, his inspiration, and now she was the source of his torment. Joshua began drinking heavily, and his life unraveled. His art, once vibrant and full of emotion, became dark and chaotic, reflecting the turmoil inside him. In a moment of drunken rage, he destroyed his studio, smashing canvases and tearing apart the very pieces that had once celebrated his love for Maggie. His self-destruction was inevitable, and though he didn't know it yet, his spiral would soon collide with the lives of the other men, drawing them all into a storm of violence and tragedy. Leonard, the quiet engineer, remained the only one untouched by the growing conflict, at least on the surface. His relationship with Maggie had always been different, simpler, quieter. He didn't ask for much from her, and she gave him just enough to keep him content. But even Leonard could feel the change. Maggie had been distant, and though he didn't suspect infidelity, he sensed that something was wrong. His quiet world, built on routines and predictability, was beginning to crumble. And though Leonard wasn't a man prone to anger or jealousy, the growing tension around him would soon force him into a confrontation he was woefully unprepared for. The stage was now set. Each man had uncovered part of Maggie's deception, and though none of them knew the full extent of her lies, they were united by a common thread: betrayal. The once separate lives of these 7 men were now intertwined in ways none of them could have predicted, and the conflict brewing beneath the surface was ready to explode. Maggie, sensing that her carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse, tried to maintain control. But even she, with all her manipulation and cunning, could not keep the inevitable from happening. The secrets were out, and the men she had once controlled were now turning against her, each driven by his own sense of betrayal, rage, and desperation. The conflict that followed would be fierce, and its consequences would be devastating. The careful facade that Maggie Aello had built over the years finally began to crack, and as with any elaborate structure, the collapse started with a single event, a seemingly minor slip, that would set off a chain reaction. The discovery that would turn her life upside down didn't come in a dramatic burst of revelation, but instead began slowly, insidiously, like poison seeping into every part of her carefully compartmentalized world. It was Anthony, the lawyer, who uncovered the first critical piece of evidence. After weeks of quiet surveillance, his private investigator had handed him a file that confirmed his worst suspicions. Maggie had not only been seeing other men, but she had also carefully woven each of them into her financial and personal affairs. The investigator had collected photographs of Maggie meeting with Joshua in his dingy studio, handing him a check to fund his latest art project. There were records of her attending high-profile social events with Malik, the fitness trainer, and even more damning receipts from luxury vacations Maggie had taken with David, the high-ranking government official. Each piece of evidence was like a punch to Anthony's ego, a reminder that he had never been the special, irreplaceable lover he had imagined himself to be. But it was the investigator's final discovery that sealed Maggie's fate. The investigator had managed to trace several secret bank accounts in Maggie's name, accounts that had been used to make substantial payments to each of her lovers. Anthony, who had always prided himself on his intellect and ability to outthink others, realized with a cold fury that he had been nothing more than a pawn in her game. The woman he had once admired for her power and independence was now revealed to be a master manipulator, playing not just him but all of the other men for her own benefit. Anthony, however, was not a man to act impulsively. His mind, trained to analyze and strategize, quickly shifted from shock and anger to calculation. Maggie's entire empire was built on her relationships and the influence she wielded over her lovers. If these secrets came to light, her world would collapse, but Anthony saw an opportunity in the wreckage. He could use this information to not only destroy her but also position himself as the orchestrator of her downfall, gaining more power in the process. As Anthony began to plot his next move, the ripples of this discovery spread further. Unknown to Anthony, David, the government official, had already received warnings that his name had surfaced in rumors surrounding Maggie. For weeks, David had been growing increasingly paranoid, aware that his political career was vulnerable to scandal. The whispers about his relationship with Maggie were becoming louder, and David knew that in his world, perception was everything. If even the faintest hint of impropriety reached the public, his career and everything he had worked for could be destroyed. David's initial response had been to distance himself from Maggie, pulling away from their meetings and becoming more secretive in his communications with her. But the more he tried to withdraw, the more entangled he became. Maggie, sensing his coldness, had pushed harder, using the information she held over him as leverage to keep him close. She reminded him, without saying it outright, that she had the power to ruin him just as easily as he could ruin her. It was a subtle threat wrapped in their intimate conversations, but David understood it clearly. When Anthony's private investigator began spreading information about Maggie's affairs, it didn't take long for it to reach David's ears. One evening, in the quiet of his office, David received an anonymous envelope containing photographs of Maggie and another man, Malik, the fitness trainer. The images were innocuous enough on the surface: Maggie and Malik entering a restaurant together, a lingering touch on her arm as they left, but to David, they were a declaration of war. Maggie had betrayed him, not only emotionally but politically. She had compromised him by associating with men who could be used against him, and David knew that if these photographs ever reached the public, it would be the end of his political career. Furious and feeling trapped, David took the only course of action that seemed logical to him. He called in favors from his contacts in intelligence. He wanted to know everything about the men Maggie was involved with, and the more he learned, the the more dangerous the situation became. Maggie wasn't just a woman juggling multiple lovers, she was a woman with influence, who had access to financial resources and political favors that could destabilize the careers of powerful men. David knew he wasn't the only one being manipulated. There were others, men just as vulnerable as him. And they were all in Maggie's orbit, unaware of the ticking time bomb she had created. While Anthony and David were setting their plans in motion, Samson, the journalist, had also reached a critical juncture. His investigation into Maggie's life had led him to a crossroads. The deeper he dug, the more he realized how tangled Maggie's relationships were, not just emotionally, but financially and politically. Samson had discovered ties between Maggie's businesses and several of the men she was involved with, including suspicious financial transactions between her and both Joshua and David. Samson had even found connections to Jared, the ex-convict, who appeared to have received large sums of money from Maggie with no clear explanation. For Samson, this was the story of a lifetime. If he exposed Maggie's web of deceit, it could take down some of the most powerful men in Nairobi. But the risks were enormous. Samson knew that once this story broke, it would cause a scandal that would not only destroy Maggie but also put his own life in danger. Powerful people didn't fall quietly, and Samson was well aware of the lengths to which men like David would go to protect their reputations. As Samson struggled with the moral and professional dilemma of whether to publish his findings, his own personal feelings toward Maggie complicated the matter further. He had been one of her lovers, and though he had convinced himself that he was different, that he had been smarter, more objective, he now realized he had been just as manipulated as the others. The betrayal stung, but more than that, Samson felt a sense of responsibility. He had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. While Samson deliberated, Joshua, the artist, was spiraling out of control. The evidence of Maggie's infidelity had pushed him to the edge of madness. His art, once vibrant and full of life, had become dark and chaotic, reflecting the turmoil inside him. Joshua had always been the sensitive one, the romantic dreamer who believed in love above all else. Maggie had been his muse, his reason for creating, and now that she had betrayed him, he could no longer find the beauty in anything. His life had become a series of self-destructive actions: drinking, lashing out, destroying the very work that had once brought him joy. One evening, in a fit of rage and desperation, Joshua decided to confront Maggie. He couldn't bear the thought of her being with another man, and the idea that he had been nothing more than a plaything in her grand game was more than he could handle. Armed with the knowledge that she had been seeing Anthony, he went to Maggie's estate, his mind clouded with anger and alcohol. But when he arrived, what he found was not Maggie, but Malik, the fitness trainer, entering her home. The sight of Malik, young, fit, and everything Joshua was not, was the final blow. Joshua's jealousy turned to blind rage, and though he didn't act on it immediately, the violence that simmered beneath the surface was ready to explode. While Joshua's rage festered, Malik remained oblivious to the storm brewing around him. In his mind, he had nothing to fear. He believed that Maggie's affection for him was genuine, and his ego, fueled by years of admiration and attention from others, blinded him to the danger. Malik had never been one to question Maggie's absences or inconsistencies. He was content to live in the moment, enjoying the physical and emotional satisfaction that their relationship brought him. But even Malik could sense that something had changed. Maggie had become more distant, more preoccupied, and though Malik's vanity told him that he was still her favorite, a small seed of doubt had been planted in his mind. One evening, Malik received an anonymous message and email containing photographs of Maggie with another man. The man in the photos was David, the government official. Malik, shocked and humiliated, couldn't believe what he was seeing. Maggie, the woman he had thought adored him, had been seeing other men all along. For someone as vain and self-obsessed as Malik, this was more than just a betrayal, it was a blow to his very sense of self. How could she have chosen someone like David over him? A man who wasn't nearly as young, fit, or attractive. The seeds of rage and jealousy that had been planted in Malik's mind now began to take root. He started watching Maggie more closely, looking for signs of her continued betrayal. His jealousy turned into obsession, and soon Malik was following her, trying to catch her in the act. Each time he saw her with another man, his anger grew, until it was no longer just about Maggie, it was about reclaiming his sense of superiority. Malik couldn't stand the thought that he had been replaced, that he had been nothing more than another pawn in her game. The illusion of control he had always believed he held over his life was shattering, and with it, his grip on reality. As Malik's obsession deepened, Leonard, the quiet engineer, remained blissfully unaware of the chaos unfolding around him. Leonard had always been the least involved in the drama of Maggie's life, content to exist on the periphery, never demanding more than she was willing to give. But even Leonard could sense that something was wrong. Maggie had been distant, and though he didn't suspect infidelity, he knew that she was hiding something from him. One evening, Leonard made the fateful decision to visit Maggie unannounced. He had never done so before, always respecting the boundaries she had set. But his growing unease pushed him to act. When Leonard arrived at her estate, he was met with a sight he never expected: Maggie, in the arms of Samson, the journalist. The realization hit him like a freight train. Maggie, the woman he had loved in his quiet, unassuming way, had been lying to him all along. The discovery shattered Leonard's world. He had always been the one who trusted her implicitly, never questioning her motives or actions. Now he realized that he had been nothing more than another piece in her puzzle, another man she had used and discarded. The quiet rage that had been simmering inside him for years, buried beneath layers of politeness and restraint, began to surface. The stage was set. Maggie's deception had finally been exposed, and each of the 7 men in her life, driven by jealousy, betrayal, and rage, was now on a collision course. The discovery of her lies had ignited a fire that could no longer be contained, and the consequences would be catastrophic. The night of the murder began in unsettling silence. Maggie Aello, sitting in the opulent comfort of her living room, swirled the red wine in her glass, contemplating her next move. For years she had maintained perfect control over her tangled relationships, her power extending like invisible strings over the men she juggled, each fulfilling a different part of her complex desires. But now she could feel the tension building. The air felt thicker, her instincts sharper. Each of the 7 men had started pulling away, their patience thinning, their devotion unraveling. Maggie sensed their growing doubts but remained confident in her ability to manipulate them back into her grasp. The first to arrive that fateful evening was Joshua, the artist. His descent into madness had been slow but relentless. Maggie had been his muse, the source of his inspiration, but her betrayal had gutted him. As he stood outside her mansion, his heart pounded with a mixture of anger and desperation. His mind, clouded by jealousy, could no longer differentiate between love and hate. His shaking hands gripped the doorknob as he pushed the door open unlocked, as if she had been expecting someone. But it wasn't Joshua alone who would meet Maggie that night. Next came Anthony, the lawyer, driven not just by betrayal but by a sense of humiliation. He had once believed himself to be the smartest man in the room, the one who understood the game Maggie was playing. Yet the evidence of her deceit had piled up, leaving him seething. He too had arrived with a plan to confront her, expose her lies, make her pay for underestimating him. But what Anthony hadn't counted on was the presence of the others. As the night wore on, the rest of the men arrived, each armed with their own emotional baggage. Malik, the fitness trainer, whose vanity had been bruised by the discovery of Maggie's infidelity; David, the politician, whose career now hung in the balance due to her careless entanglements; Leonard, quiet and introspective, yet broken by her betrayal; Samson, whose journalistic instincts had uncovered more than he'd ever wanted to know; and Jared, the ex-convict, whose volatile temper had been simmering for weeks. Inside the mansion, the confrontation spiraled out of control. Accusations flew, and the men turned on each other, each blaming the other for Maggie's lies. In the chaos, Maggie, seeing her web of control collapse, tried to escape. She darted toward the stairs, but in the heated argument, Jared, overwhelmed by his rage, shoved her back. Maggie stumbled, lost her balance, and fell. Her body struck the marble steps with a sickening thud, and the house fell silent. Maggie Akello was dead. The men, now bound by the shared horror of what had just happened, stood in shock, the gravity of their actions slowly sinking in. None had intended for this to happen, but the consequences of their emotions had spiraled beyond their control. Their once shared obsession with Maggie had led them to a single, deadly conclusion. Now they faced the aftermath together. The aftermath of Maggie Akello's death settled like a suffocating weight over the men who had once been bound by their obsession with her. As her lifeless body lay at the bottom of the marble staircase, a silence blanketed the mansion, broken only by the shallow breaths and nervous glances exchanged between the 7 men. None of them had anticipated this outcome. What began as a night of confrontation had spiraled into something much darker, a murder. And now, each of them was left grappling with the brutal reality of their involvement. Jared, the ex-convict, stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. His hand had been the one to push her, but it hadn't been intentional, at least. That's what he kept telling himself. The rage that had consumed him moments ago drained from his body, leaving him hollow and terrified. The others, though equally shaken, knew that Jared's violent past would make him the prime suspect if they didn't act quickly. The instinct to survive, to protect themselves, kicked in for each of them. Anthony, the lawyer, was the first to break the silence, his sharp mind already formulating a plan. They couldn't call the police, it would ruin them all. Each man had ties to Maggie that could destroy their careers, their reputations, their lives. The scandal would be too great, the consequences too severe. Anthony knew that if any of them were implicated in her death, their connections to Maggie's deceit and manipulation would unravel under scrutiny, exposing everything. Without speaking, they silently agreed to cover up the crime. David, the politician, coldly calculated the risks, realizing that his career would be obliterated if anyone knew the extent of his involvement with Maggie. He began directing the others to clean the scene, using his authoritative tone to mask the fear that clung to him like a second skin. Malik, ever focused on his physicality, began wiping down surfaces, moving with robotic precision, as if this act of cleaning could somehow erase his guilt. Samson, the journalist, felt a crushing weight in his chest. He had spent weeks investigating Maggie's life, uncovering the truth about her manipulations, but now he was part of the very story he had sought to expose. His journalistic instincts screamed at him to document what was happening, but the reality of his own involvement kept him silent. Leonard, the quiet engineer, moved in a daze, his mind unable to reconcile the gentle love he had once felt for Maggie with the violent reality of her death. As they worked to stage the scene, carefully removing any trace of their presence, the weight of their shared guilt hung heavy in the air. The mansion, once a symbol of Maggie's power, had become a tomb, a silent witness to the chaos she had cultivated. Each man, bound together by her lies, was now equally bound by the secret of her death. When they finally left the mansion that night, their lives had been irreparably changed. Each man carried the burden of Maggie's death in his own way. Joshua, the artist, descended further into madness, consumed by guilt and grief. His art, once vibrant, became dark and chaotic, reflecting the turmoil inside him. Malik retreated into himself, his once proud confidence shattered, his vanity turned to shame. David buried himself in his work, trying to suppress the scandal that could still emerge, while Anthony became consumed with paranoia, convinced that one of the others would crack and expose them all. In the days that followed, Maggie's death was ruled an accident, a tragic fall down the stairs in her grand mansion. But the truth remained buried, a shared secret that connected the 7 men in a way none of them could escape. They had all been caught in Maggie's web, and now, even in death, she controlled them, haunting their thoughts, their dreams, their lives. The men would go on, but they would never truly be free. The memory of that night, the weight of their actions, would follow them like shadows, always lurking, always threatening to resurface. They had come to confront Maggie, each driven by their own desires and betrayals, but in the end it was their own souls that had been shattered, forever marked by the woman who had held them all in her deadly grip.